The air inside the private dojo was thick with sweat and skepticism. A heavyweight national judo champion stepped onto the mat, fully intending to humiliate the man Hollywood called a master. What happened next in those 3 violent minutes didn't just break egos, it shattered everything the traditional martial arts world believed. It was the autumn of 1968, and the sprawling, secluded estate nestled deep within the Hollywood Hills was completely sealed off from the public eye. The property belonged to David Harrison, a wildly successful real estate mogul and an obsessive patron of the martial arts. David's estate boasted a custom-built 1,000-square-foot dojo with imported Japanese tatami mats, vaulted cedar ceilings, and a pristine aesthetic that screamed tradition. For years, David had hosted closed-door sparring sessions, inviting only the most elite fighters, senses, and champions to test their mettle away from the cameras, the crowds, and the judges. On this particular evening, the atmosphere in the dojo was unusually tense. The guest of honor was a young, fiercely charismatic martial artist whose name was rapidly becoming a household word: Bruce Lee. Bruce had recently gained fame as Kato on television, but within the secretive circles of martial arts purists, he was a polarizing figure. To some, he was a revolutionary, a man stripping away centuries of useless dogma. To others, particularly the rigid traditionalists, he was an arrogant actor, a flashy upstart who dared to criticize classical styles he didn't fully understand. Standing by the heavy wooden doors of the dojo, arms crossed over a barrel-like chest, was Arthur Sullivan. Arthur was a mountain of a man, standing 6'3" and weighing a dense 230 pounds. He was a 4th-degree black belt in Judo, a 3-time national heavyweight champion, and an alternate for the Olympic team. With cauliflower ears, a thick neck, and hands that looked like leather catcher's mitts, Arthur was the embodiment of raw, functional grappling power. Beside him stood his longtime coach, Robert Dempsey, a stern, unsmiling purist who viewed Bruce Lee's philosophy of Jeet Kune Do as little more than undisciplined, chaotic street brawling disguised as profound wisdom. The room was filled with about 20 spectators, a who's who of high-ranking black belts from various disciplines. Men like Thomas Reed, a respected karate instructor, and William Gallagher, another heavyweight judoka, lined the perimeter of the mats. They had all come for one reason: to see if the Hollywood Golden Boy could back up his controversial claims in a room full of real killers. Bruce stood in the center of the mat, completely relaxed. He weighed a mere 135 pounds. Dressed in a simple white t-shirt, dark sweatpants, and soled shoes, he looked entirely out of place in a room dominated by heavy, starched white gi-tops and meticulously tied black belts. Bruce was in the middle of a lecture, moving with an almost feline grace as he demonstrated his concepts of center-line control, economy of motion, and the vital importance of being like water. "You see," Bruce explained, his voice echoing lightly off the cedar walls, his hands moving in a blur to emphasize his points. "When you adopt a fixed stance, you are a statue. You are predictable. A classical form is a tombstone. In a real fight, the opponent doesn't throw a textbook punch and leave his arm hanging there for you to block and counter. A real fight is alive. It is chaos. You must intercept their intention before it becomes action." From the edge of the room, a loud, derisive snort interrupted the demonstration. All eyes shifted to Arthur Sullivan. The giant judoka pushed himself off the wall, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "That's a beautiful speech, Mr. Lee." Arthur's deep voice boomed, dripping with sarcasm. "It sounds great on television. It looks fantastic when you're hitting willing partners or breaking wooden boards. But boards don't hit back, and boards certainly don't grab you." The room fell dead silent. David Harrison shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden escalation, but he didn't intervene. This was exactly the kind of raw, unfiltered clash of ideologies his dojo was built for. Bruce stopped his pacing. He turned slowly to face Arthur, his expression unreadable, entirely devoid of the anger one might expect from a public insult. He tilted his head slightly. "And what happens when someone grabs you, Arthur?" "When a real grappler gets their hands on you," Arthur said, taking a slow, heavy step onto the tatami. All that philosophy, all that water nonsense goes out the window. When I grab your jacket, I control your posture. When I control your posture, I control your balance. And when I take your balance, I smash you into the floor. You can't intercept gravity, Bruce. You can't outspeed physics. Robert Dempsey, Arthur's coach, nodded approvingly from the sidelines. He's right, Lee, Dempsey chimed in. You talk about realism, but you avoid the reality of a clinch. You operate at striking distance because you know that if a man Arthur's size closes the gap, your speed means nothing. He will break you in half. Bruce didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, a small, knowing smile crept onto his face. It was the smile of a predator who had just been invited to dinner. He casually gestured to the empty space on the mat in front of him. Well, Bruce said softly, the quietness of his voice cutting through the tension like a straight razor. Philosophy is only useful if it can be applied. I don't wear a gi, Arthur, but you are welcome to grab my shirt. You are welcome to grab my arms. Come show me your physics. The challenge hung in the air. The black belts watching exchanged stunned glances. Bruce Lee, at 135 pounds, had just invited a 230-pound national judo champion to grab him. It was tactical suicide. It was madness. Arthur's eyes narrowed. The smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, professional intensity. He shed his track jacket, revealing a massive, heavily muscled torso wrapped in a traditional, heavy-duty white judo gi. He tightened his black belt with a sharp, violent snap that echoed through the silent room. No rules, Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous. No forms, Bruce corrected gently, sinking slightly into a relaxed, modified neutral stance, his hands floating lightly in front of him. Just truth. The spectators instinctively backed up, pressing themselves against the wooden walls of the dojo to clear as much space as possible. David Harrison stepped forward to act as an impromptu referee, though everyone in the room knew this was no longer a sporting match. It was a matter of profound pride and martial validation. Gentlemen, David said, his voice tight. Clean break, if I call it. Otherwise, defend yourselves. Arthur Sullivan nodded once. Bruce Lee simply stared, his eyes locked onto Arthur's collarbone, a tracking point that allowed his peripheral vision to monitor the giant's hips and shoulders simultaneously. Begin, David said, stepping quickly away. For a moment, nobody moved. The contrast between the two men was almost comical. Arthur stood in a low, wide, traditional judo posture, his massive arms extended slightly, fingers curved like meat hooks, ready to secure a dominant grip. Bruce, conversely, was constantly in motion. He didn't bounce, but he slid, his feet taking tiny, rapid micro-steps, his lead hand constantly probing the air, flicking out and retracting like a snake's tongue. Arthur decided to force the issue. He knew he had a near 100-pound weight advantage. Strategy was simple. Wade through whatever light strikes Bruce through. Take the hits, close the distance, secure the lapel, and execute an Soto-Garia major outer reaping throw that would slam Bruce the back of his head onto the mat with crushing force. Arthur lunged. He exploded forward with astonishing speed for a man of his size, his lead hand reaching out to snatch the fabric of Bruce's shirt at the chest. He never made contact. Bruce didn't block the reaching hand. He simply wasn't there. With a blindingly fast lateral shuffle, Bruce stepped completely off the center line. As Arthur's heavy hand grabbed empty air, Bruce simultaneously unleashed a sharp, stinging back fist that cracked like a whip across the back of Arthur's outstretched wrist, immediately followed by a devastating driving sidekick directly to Arthur's lead knee. The impact sounded like a baseball bat striking a heavy bag. Arthur grunted, his forward momentum jarringly arrested as his knee buckled slightly. The judoka stumbled, but his competitive instinct kicked in. Instead of retreating, Arthur roared, abandoning technique for a moment and lunging forward with both arms to engulf the smaller man in a bear hug. This was the moment the traditionalists in the room had been waiting for. Thomas Reed and William Gallagher leaned forward. Once Arthur secured his grip, the fight would be over. Arthur's massive arms crashed into Bruce, his thick fingers successfully wrapping around Bruce's left arm and a handful of his t-shirt at the shoulder. Arthur immediately yanked Bruce toward him, stepping in deep to load his hips under Bruce's center of gravity for a high-amplitude throw. The sheer mechanical force of the pull was immense. But here is where the reality of the fight severely deviated from the expectations of the black belts watching. A traditional martial artist, when grabbed by a larger man, instinctively pulls away, resisting the force. That resistance is exactly what a judoka needs. They use that opposing tension to execute their throw. Bruce didn't pull away. Instead of fighting Arthur's massive pulling force, Bruce went with it. He accelerated his own body weight in the exact direction Arthur was pulling, turning what should have been a stable, anchored throw into a catastrophic collision. Moving faster than Arthur could process, Bruce collapsed the distance entirely. As Arthur turned his hips to initiate the throw, Bruce flowed like water around the rigid structure. Instead of trying to break Arthur's iron grip on his shirt, Bruce used his free right hand to execute a flawless paksao, slapping hand, violently pinning Arthur's gripping hand against his own chest, trapping the giant. Simultaneously, Bruce dropped his base, sinking his weight into a deep horse stance, rendering him incredibly heavy and immovable, entirely ruining Arthur's hip leverage. Before Arthur could adjust, Bruce unleashed a terrifying sequence of close-quarters devastation. With his left arm still theoretically controlled by Arthur, Bruce simply bent his elbow, turning his forearm into a weapon. He delivered a brutal short-range elbow strike directly into the brachial plexus, the nerve cluster, on the side of Arthur's thick neck. Arthur's eyes widened in shock. His grip instantly lost its strength as a shockwave of pain and numbness radiated down his arm. The traditionalists in the room gasped. They were watching a man dismantle a giant, not with brute strength, but with devastating, surgical precision and an absolute refusal to play by the established rules of grappling. Arthur staggered back, clutching his neck, his pride wounded far more deeply than his flesh. He was breathing heavily, a stark contrast to Bruce, whose chest barely heaved, his face utterly serene. "You're relying on your strength, Arthur," Bruce said calmly, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the dojo. "But strength is finite. When you grab me, you anchor yourself to me. You think you are controlling my body, but you are only giving me a bridge to strike yours." Robert Dempsey, red-faced on the sidelines, shouted, "Don't listen to him, Artie. Crush him. Take it to the ground." But Arthur shook off the numbness. He was furious now. He abandoned the elegant, sweeping setups of traditional sport judo. He lowered his head like a charging bull, raised his arms in a tight guard to protect his neck, and bulldozed forward. He intended to simply tackle Bruce to the floor, using his raw mass to flatten the martial arts philosopher. The dojo braced for the impact. Arthur was an avalanche of muscle and bone. But Bruce Lee, standing in the center of the mat, did not retreat a single inch. He waited for the giant to cross the point of no return. The true lesson of Jeet Kune was about to be violently demonstrated to every black belt in the room. The dojo braced for the inevitable impact. Arthur Sullivan was an avalanche of muscle, bone, and bruised ego. Lowering his head, he tucked his chin behind his massive shoulders, raising his thick arms to guard his neck from further nerve strikes. He abandoned the elegant, sweeping setups of his beloved sport judo. This was no longer about a clean, scoring throw. He intended to simply tackle Bruce Lee to the polished cedar floor, using his 230 pounds of raw mass to flatten the martial arts philosopher and smother his speed. Robert Dempsey, Arthur's coach, leaned over the edge of the tatami, his fists clenched in anticipation. "Drive through him, Artie. Take his legs." Dempsey barked, his voice sharp and desperate. William Gallagher and Thomas Reed, the other high-ranking traditionalists, watched with bated breath. In their world, a committed takedown from a heavyweight champion against a man 90 pounds lighter was a definitive, inescapable ending. But Bruce Lee, standing perfectly balanced in the center of the mat, did not retreat a single inch. He did not sprawl backward to defend the impending tackle, nor did he circle away to avoid the charge. He waited for the giant to cross the point of no return. Jeet Kune Do translates to the way of the intercepting fist. It is built on a premise so brutally simple that most classical systems overlook it entirely. The most efficient way to stop an attack is to attack the attack. As Arthur closed the final 3 feet, his massive legs churning the mat. Bruce exploded. Bruce's right lead leg snapped upward from the floor with the velocity of a coiled spring releasing. It was a Tekhan intercepting stop kick. Instead of aiming for the head or chest, Bruce violently drove the blade of his soft-soled shoe directly into Arthur's advancing shin, just inches below the kneecap. The timing was mathematically perfect. Bruce caught Arthur's leg at the exact millisecond it was bearing the giant's full plunging body weight. The single father named echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Arthur's forward momentum, previously his greatest weapon, became his absolute undoing. The stop kick acted like a steel rod jammed into the spokes of a speeding motorcycle. Arthur's lower half was instantly immobilized, but his heavy torso continued hurtling forward, completely destroying his posture and balance. Arthur's head pitched downward, his guard instinctively opening as he flailed to stop his impending faceplant. Bruce did not wait for the giant to fall. The instant his kicking foot returned to the mat, Bruce lunged forward, closing the microscopic gap. He launched a straight blast, a relentless rapid-fire sequence of chain punches straight down the center line. Bruce's fists blurred, striking Arthur's nose, jaw, and throat in rapid succession. Pop, 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 pop. The strikes weren't looping, power-heavy haymakers. They were short, incredibly sharp, and utterly overwhelming, disrupting Arthur's vision and scrambling his equilibrium. Blinded, off balance, and absorbing a dozen strikes a second, Arthur operated on pure panicked instinct. As he collapsed forward, his thick arms blindly swept the air, desperately seeking anything to anchor onto. By sheer luck, Arthur's massive right arm wrapped around Bruce's waist, while his left hand clamped onto the fabric of Bruce's sweatpants. With a guttural roar, Arthur used the last of his forward momentum to drag them both down to the tatami. "He's got him," Dempsey yelled, slamming a hand against the wall. "Now show him what the ground is, Artie." The traditionalists collectively exhaled. The fight had finally reached the mat, the absolute domain of the judoka. In Newaza, groundwork, speed and striking were widely considered useless against the crushing pressure and positional dominance of a grappling master. Arthur, despite his bleeding nose and aching shin, immediately went to work. He scrambled heavily over Bruce's legs, attempting to pass his guard and secure Kesagatame, the scarf hold, from which he could easily crush Bruce's ribs or apply an inescapable submission. But Bruce had never agreed to play by the rules of sport judo. As Arthur drove his heavy shoulder into Bruce's chest, trying to pin him flat, Bruce didn't attempt to bridge or wrestle the heavier man off. That would have been a contest of pure strength, a contest Bruce would inevitably lose. Instead, Bruce entirely ignored the grappling positional hierarchy. Arthur reached around Bruce's head to secure his collar for a choke. In doing so, he exposed his own arm and neck. Bruce immediately snaked his right arm inside Arthur's thick bicep. But he didn't grab the gi. He didn't look for an armbar. Bruce drove the rigid tips of his stiffened fingers directly into the soft tissue of Arthur's armpit, digging into the exposed bundle of nerves with agonizing force. At the exact same moment, Bruce's left hand shot upward, his palm violently cupping Arthur's right ear, creating a vacuum effect designed to rupture the eardrum, while his thumb hooked dangerously close to the corner of Arthur's eye. Finally, Bruce brought his right knee up with explosive force, driving it hard into the inside of Arthur's thigh, missing the groin by an intentional, calculated inch. Arthur froze. The giant judoka was hovering over Bruce, technically in a dominant top position, yet completely paralyzed by a sudden terrifying realization. The sharp pain in his armpit was crippling. His hearing was ringing from the palm strike, and he could feel the terrifying pressure of Bruce's thumb resting lightly against his eyelid. In a sport match, Arthur would be winning. In the reality of the dojo mat right now, Arthur knew with chilling certainty that if Bruce decided to contract his muscles for one more second, Arthur would be permanently blinded, deafened, and maimed. The silence in David Harrison's private dojo was absolute, heavy, and profound. The only sound was the ragged, heavy breathing of Arthur Sullivan, frozen in the top position, sweat dripping from his nose onto the pristine white fabric of his gi. Beneath him, Bruce Lee was completely still, his breathing even and untroubled. His eyes, staring up into Arthur's, held no malice, no anger, and no competitive fury. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a scientist who had just successfully concluded an experiment. "In a tournament, Arthur," Bruce whispered softly, his voice meant only for the giant above him, "you would score a point for this takedown. You would wait for the referee to reset us, or you would try to choke me with my collar. But there are no referees on the street. There are no mats. There are no rules prohibiting me from taking your sight, crushing your windpipe, or destroying your knees. Are you still grappling with me, or are you fighting for your life?" Arthur swallowed hard. The absolute truth of Bruce's words pierced through years of conditioned sports training. Arthur had spent his entire life mastering a rule set. Bruce Lee had spent his life mastering human anatomy and the brutal reality of survival. Arthur realized that his opponent wasn't trying to out-wrestle him. His opponent was systematically dismantling the very concept of the wrestling match itself. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur pulled his arms back. He shifted his weight off Bruce's chest, raising his hands in a clear gesture of submission. "I yield," Arthur croaked, his deep voice thick with a mixture of shame, awe, and a profound sense of relief. Bruce instantly released his terrifying grips. The tension vanished from his body, replaced by the same relaxed, fluid grace he had exhibited at the beginning of the evening. Bruce rolled backward, kipping up to his feet in one smooth, explosive motion. He didn't celebrate. He didn't look toward the audience for validation. Instead, he reached down, offering a hand to the battered giant on the floor. Arthur looked at the outstretched hand for a long moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, he grasped it. Bruce effortlessly helped the 230-pound man to his feet. Arthur touched his bruised neck, blinked hard to clear his vision, and bowed deeply to the smaller man. It was not a superficial bow of sporting courtesy. It was a profound gesture of genuine martial respect. Bruce returned the bow, a small, warm smile finally breaking across his face. The spectators were shell-shocked. Thomas Reed, the karate instructor who had scoffed earlier, was staring at the mat as if he had just witnessed a ghost. William Gallagher was frantically whispering to himself, replaying the chaotic sequence in his mind, trying to understand how a perfect judo takedown had resulted in the judoka being entirely at the mercy of the man beneath him. Robert Dempsey stepped onto the mat, his face pale. His rigid worldview had just been shattered in less than 3 minutes. "That wasn't judo," Dempsey stammered, pointing an accusing finger at Bruce, though his voice lacked its former venom. "You used illegal strikes. You attacked the eyes. You attacked the groin. That is not honorable combat." Bruce turned slowly to face the veteran coach. He grabbed a towel from a nearby bench and wiped his face. "Honor, Mr. Dempsey, is a luxury reserved for the ring," Bruce said loudly, ensuring his voice carried to every black belt in the room. "You teach your students how to fight within a padded cell of rules. You teach them that an opponent will behave in a predictable manner. You tell them that a man cannot strike effectively from his back. You create illusions, and you call it tradition." Bruce walked slowly toward the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the masters. "Arthur is a brilliant athlete," Bruce continued, gesturing toward the giant who was currently being tended to by David Harrison. "His strength is phenomenal. His technique is flawless within the confines of his sport. But what happens when the fight leaves the mat? What happens when a man grabs you in a dark alley where there is broken glass on the ground, and he does not care about your belt rank?" Bruce paused, letting the heavy reality of his words sink in. When you are fighting for your survival, you must be entirely free from the limitations of style. You cannot be bound by a curriculum that tells you this is the only way to escape a hold. If a man grabs you, you do not fight his grip. You destroy the man holding the grip. You must be formless. You must be shapeless. Like water, when you pour water into a cup, it becomes the cup. When you pour water into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow, or it can crash. Bruce stopped pacing. He looked directly at Arthur, who was nodding slowly, the realization of the lesson finally crystallizing in his mind. "Tonight, Arthur tried to crash," Bruce concluded quietly. "But he crashed against a rock. He expected me to be a rock. Instead, I was the water that slipped through the cracks and drowned him. David Harrison stepped into the center of the room, clapping slowly. The sound broke the spell. Soon Thomas Reed joined in, followed by William Gallagher, and eventually even the reluctant Robert Dempsey. The slow applause swelled into a thunderous ovation, echoing against the cedar walls of the Hollywood dojo. They weren't clapping for a winner of a sparring match. They were applauding a paradigm shift. Every master in that room knew that they could never look at their respective arts the same way again. They had walked into the dojo believing in the supremacy of their classical systems. They walked out knowing that the future of combat had arrived, and it was wearing soft-soled shoes and a white t-shirt. Bruce Lee had not just defeated a national heavyweight champion. He had dismantled the very foundation of traditional martial arts dogma. He proved that true martial prowess was not found in the memorization of ancient forms or the accumulation of colored belts, but in the brutal, honest, and unconditioned expression of the human body in motion. The legend of Bruce Lee was no longer just a Hollywood myth whispered in magazines. In the closed-door reality of David Harrison's dojo, the dragon had proven his fire was real. This legendary closed-door encounter proved that true martial arts transcend rigid traditions and belt colors. Bruce Lee didn't just defeat a champion, he challenged a mindset, forcing the world to adapt or be left behind. Did Bruce's philosophy change how you view combat? Hit that like button, share this incredible piece of history with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of martial arts legends.